First Coast Connect, Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, safe harbor laws designed to protect victims of sex trafficking are failing young women, according to a new report. We talked to the authors of the report as they unveil their findings for the first time on this morning's program. Then, some of the hardest working people in America are homeless. We talked to the author of There Is No Place for Us about housing precarity ahead of his Jacksonville appearance next week. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Janine Herbst. This is day 2 of the federal government shutdown. Republicans and Democrats in Congress have yet to reach an agreement to fund the government. As NPR's Elena Moore reports, yesterday's Senate vote on the GOP's short-term spending bill came up 5 votes shy of the 60 needed for passage, as it did the previous day.
No votes are expected for the day in observation of Yom Kippur. Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he expects this to be a quiet day, but that conversations between lawmakers are ongoing. So far, just 2 Democrats and 1 independent have backed the GOP measure, but the divide is largely along party lines, with most Democrats vowing to oppose the bill unless it addresses soon-to-be expiring Affordable Care Act subsidies. Republicans have rejected that. Some say they're open to discussing the issue, but only after the government reopens. The next votes are expected on Friday. Elena Moore, NPR News, the Capitol.
Meanwhile, NPR's Selena Simmons-Duffin reports the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, well, a new analysis finds premiums on those plans are set to double.
This goes back to a 2021 law that created enhanced premium tax credits. Those run out at the end of December unless Congress acts. Cynthia Cox of the health research organization KFF just co-authored an analysis on what will happen to people's premiums next year.
On average, we're expecting premium payments by enrollees to increase by 114% if these enhanced tax credits expire.
So that means a lot of people are going to have to pay double the monthly premium they're paying now.
Or they might switch to a plan with a much higher deductible, or they might lose their coverage.
The Congressional Budget Office estimates that if the enhanced tax credits expire over the next several years, 4 million people will become uninsured. Selena Simmons-Duffin, NPR News, Washington.
Israel is ordering all residents of Gaza's most populous city to leave as it expands its ground operations there. The country's defense minister says anyone remaining in Gaza City will be considered, quote, militants and supporters of terror. But many of those remaining are elderly or in the hospital. Meanwhile, the Israeli military says it's intercepted almost all of the dozens of boats floating in a humanitarian aid flotilla that's been trying to sail to Gaza and deliver food there. Activists on the boats were detained, including Greta Thunberg. NPR's Emily Fang has more.
Israel's Navy and these convoy organizers say Israel's boarded and detained about 40 boats so far. This is a fast-evolving situation. Israel says they're going to deport all the activists it detains. They've repeatedly said they consider this flotilla a Hamas-linked provocation, but this is still a PR fiasco for Israel.
NPR's Emily Fang reporting from Tel Aviv. You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Noah Hertz. It's 4 minutes after the hour. Jacksonville rapper Hakeem Robinson, known as Queso, and his cousin Leroy Whitaker Jr. have both been sentenced to life in prison for the 2020 shooting death of 23-year-old Charles McCormick Jr. at an Arlington shopping center. Both men were found guilty on July 31st in a combined murder trial with 2 separate juries. The two juries heard 7 days of testimony, but closing arguments and the judge's instructions were delivered to each one separately. In other Northeast Florida news, a new pub opens this weekend in St. Augustine in the same location where another British pub closed its doors after a 32-year run. The Wobbly Whale Public House now occupies the former site of the popular King's Head British pub on U.S. Highway 1 North. The owner of King's Head has said rising costs and staffing issues forced her to close the pub last September. It was snapped up in January by Jacksonville-based First Pub LLC. As for opening day on Saturday, the owners of the Wobbly Whale say they'll focus on beer and a limited menu that includes fish and chips and bratwurst. Today, expect a 30% chance of thunderstorms here in Northeast Florida after about 2 p.m., mostly sunny with a high near 81. Tonight, that chance of rain increases to about 60, and the low will be around 71. Expect some more rain tomorrow, pretty high possibility with a high near 81. Coming up next, it's First Coast Connect here on WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Capital One, offering their premium travel card, Venture X. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. Details at CapitalOne.com. And listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, a new report says sex traffickers and pimps are using Florida's juvenile justice system to coerce and trap their victims. We ask the report's authors what about their findings and what they say needs to happen to change that. Later in the program, author Brian Goldstone's new book contends the root of the nation's homeless crisis isn't poverty, but prosperity. First, for more than a decade, Florida law has demanded that sex-trafficked minors be treated as victims, not criminals. But a new report says too often that's not the case. The Delores Barr Weaver Policy Center is releasing their findings publicly in a couple of hours. But here to give us an early look is Vicky Basra, the center's president and CEO and one of the study's authors. Good morning, Vicky.
Good morning.
We are also joined by Stacy Ellison, the center's vice president of development and communications. Good morning, Stacy.
Thank you for having us.
So I'll just start, Stacy. First of all, thank you for releasing the report this morning on the program. The report's called See the Girl, Trafficked Behind Closed Doors. And it basically is looking at shortfalls of a 2012 law called the Florida Safe Harbor Act. Can you just remind us what that law is supposed to do?
Well, the law, with the Policy Center's advocacy efforts and partners in Tallahassee, was enacted to ensure that juveniles in our community, minors, are treated as victims, not criminals, understanding that when a young person is in the midst of commercial sexual exploitation, i.e. human trafficking, there are so many situations that they find themselves in as a result of the coercion and the violence and the situations that are being imposed on them because of their exploiters. The purpose of the Safe Harbor law was to ensure that these young people are recognized as the victims of a crime and that they are not criminalized and then burdened with resulting charges, legal fees, all of the things that result from that justice system involvement.
And so that law is designed to make sure that people, that they are given resources that are appropriate for their circumstance as victims and not incarcerated and locked up and punished for behaviors that are associated with their victimization. Your report looks at whether that's happening.
Absolutely, because what we understand is that when you do incarcerate these young people, you are perpetuating the traumas in their lives. And once a young person is engaged with the justice system, I tell you what, Anne, it's a very hard cycle to extricate yourself from. And Vicky has absolute knowledge and expertise in really even the impact of this incarceration for young people.
So, Vicky, you began this report because you were hearing and also seeing in the work that you do, the hands-on work, that what was supposed to be happening was not happening. Tell us about what you were hearing and seeing and what ultimately your report has concluded.
So, our team members who work in the community, work in the detention centers, work in the court systems, were coming back and letting us know that while so many girls were being arrested, there was a component of trafficking they were sharing about. While many of them didn't label it as trafficking, the stories really connected as recognizing these girls were being trafficked. And so we started digging deeper to try to understand what's really happening. Is the trafficking and the criminal activity linked, or is it two separate things? Is the trafficker coercing the young person to get involved in the criminal activity? And so we started by looking at the state studies. And what the state study shows that 1 in 3 girls who is in the criminal justice system has also been a victim of human trafficking. We then started looking at our own data, what was happening for the girls we specifically served. And we found that 53% of them had been arrested at some point. And we recognize that the law is failing. The exact people it should be protecting, it's failing them. And we wanted to understand, where is the failure? Why are we seeing this? And we found, one, that the assessment tool that we're presently using to understand whether or not girls and young people are being trafficked isn't asking the right questions. It isn't recognizing that most of the girls, most of the young people are being trafficked by somebody they know, and therefore they don't recognize it as a trafficking situation. And so we need to ask the questions differently. Second, we understand that young people are more likely to share what's happening to them with survivor advocates, so those with lived experiences, than anybody else. And so we want to really talk about, how do we engage survivor advocates in the work so that they can be part of the first response.
One of the challenges that you note in the report is that very often identifying victims, it can be more challenging because the victims don't identify themselves as victims. They don't self-identify as victims of sexual trafficking or sexual violence. In some cases, talk about the relationships that they have that are that allow them to sort of have that impression and that self-definition that perhaps somebody that recognizes sex trafficking would see differently.
So what we learned in a prior research study we did was that most of the predators or the traffickers that get engaged with these young people, they are looking for gaps in the individual's life. So they're looking at whether or not this person has any healthy relationships or strong relationships. They're looking at, does this person have a place to stay? Are they addicted to drugs? They take those gaps, and that's what they build their relationship on. This is not happening overnight. It usually is a 3 to 6 month period. And what they do is they show up as being very helpful. I will find you a place to live, or you can come live with me. I have a family, come join my family so you don't feel alone, right? And we define this as predatory helpfulness. Mm-hmm. And our young people, whose brains aren't fully developed, don't see this person as a predator. They see this person as someone being really, really helpful, who's come in and protected them like no other adult has. They build trust in the relationship. And so when the transition happens from that helpful relationship to a predatory relationship, they're made to believe that somehow it's their fault. They're made to believe that if they seek any support, nobody is going to support them. Nobody's going to believe them. By this time, it's 3 to 6 months into the relationship.
Is it usually sort of like a stair step to get to what we think of as traditional sex trafficking? I mean, are there sort of steps that they have their victims engage in that sort of ease the path? Because it does seem like it would be a difficult turn for anybody to sort of suddenly find themselves openly sex trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times it's this trusting relationship, and then, hey, we've run out of money. We need money. If you want to keep living in the hotel or the motel with me, we need money. Just do this one time. Let's just make enough money to get through this week. So there's a lot of coercion that happens that makes the individual believe that this relationship, that she's supporting the relationship. It can also be violent. So some women have talked about how the relationship was really nice, and then all of a sudden one day, the trafficker became violent. So there's multiple ways that switch happens from being a really helpful relationship to one that becomes very violent and unsafe.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to the authors of a new report that says Northeast Florida is failing young sex trafficking victims. You can join the conversation by calling 904-549-2937 or emailing firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Stacy, I sort of alluded in the intro to the fact that some traffickers are using the criminal justice system, are using the juvenile justice system to exploit, to trap their victims. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Well, while I am certainly not the expert, I can tell you what I've learned as I have read our research and spoken with our professionals at work as well. And traffickers, predators, are incredibly crafty and incredibly knowledgeable of how systems work. Therefore, they are able to manipulate them. I've learned so much from Vicky, sitting with her and listening to her. And if, in fact, a young person is incarcerated, is locked up for perhaps misdemeanor charges related to their trafficking, guess who's usually coming to bail them out? It would be their trafficker. They understand how to work the system so that they then, to Vicky's point, are perpetuating the idea in this young person's head that this is the only person I have. This is the only person who's coming to help me. Those connections become deeper as they become more and more unsafe. And it's something that as a community, we must recognize how these cycles happen so that we are able, as a community, to enact the policies and procedures that break those cycles and those unhealthy connections.
You know, in terms of cycles, you were talking about different coercive methods, Vicky. One of the things that the report talks about that is just especially distressing is the idea that very often victims are threatened with the exploitation of their children if they don't consent or if they don't participate in sex trafficking. That more than 20% of the people that you serve say that that was a threat that was made to them, that their children would be trafficked if they didn't do it themselves.
Absolutely. The trafficker is using multiple factors to coerce, whether it's addiction, whether it's their children, whether it's that I'm going to tell your family, I'm going to tell them what you're doing. Their whole relationship is built on threat and fear. And so when I'm living in a space of threat and fear, a person can make me do whatever they want me to do, especially if they threaten my children.
So one of the things that traffickers can use if somebody has begun participating, whether it's to help with the rent or, to pay for a bill, if they've engaged in that once, is to shame them. The fact that they've become this thing, this other person by their behavior. And so shame is a big part of it. And I'm curious what relationship the Policy Center has to sort of, I guess you'd call it kind of more positive sex worker philosophies. And whether, you obviously are dealing, and these laws we're talking about are with minors who are unable to consent to sex trafficking. That's the law says, and that's agreed upon. But is it difficult? Are messages getting mixed when people are trying to also create safe spaces for, what they define as sex workers as opposed to people who are being exploited by sex trafficking?
So I get asked this question often, and I always start by saying no girl wakes up at the age of 10, 12, thinking one day I want to grow up and this is what I want to do. And so whether we legalize it or don't, I think the question comes back to, is it a real choice to be engaged in this, whether it's professional sex work or whether it's being trafficked? Because I believe that if women had more choices and opportunities to make similar amounts of money, if there were less barriers for women who've been in the criminal justice system to attain jobs where they could get a true living wage, then there's concept of choice, right? But when there's no real choice, then I think the question we ask is really a mute question, because we're talking about an occupation that nobody grows up in school saying they want to be part of.
Sure. And I think of no parent wishes that for their child.
And so that does seem like at least in the early days of a universal belief. What are some of the recommendations, Stacy, that the report is making here in terms of things like the assessment tools? Or Vicky, I don't know if that's something you'd rather address.
Absolutely. So, as I shared earlier, definitely taking a look at our assessment tool, seeing are we asking the right questions to really understand what's happening in this young person's life, right? What actually happened to even get them to a point that they're now have been coerced into the relationship, understanding the relationship. Second is really involving survivor advocates in the work. We know they can do this work better than any one of us can. Girls tell me all the time, Miss Vicky, I don't want to talk to you. I want to talk to someone who gets it, who understands what I've been through, who can speak the way, I understand them and they understand me. I think we also need to implement more formal insight over what is happening. So when we see these young people incarcerated in front of judges, are we asking the right questions? And that goes back to also making sure we're gathering the data.
Mhm.
So while we have data on the girls we're serving, we believe we need to be doing a statewide study to really understand what's happening at the state level. We can tell you what's happening here in Duval County, but better understanding the state level and then training. Our first responders need training so that when they see certain things, they can recognize what's happening. They can understand what questions they need to be asking and what to do when a young person in front of them identifies as being trafficked.
Well, you talk about involving survivors in the process, and the report gets pretty specific about some ideas on that front, including whether if there's a call that comes in to 911 or to a first responder in an emergency situation that involves a minor, that you would like to see it, if not routine, at least somewhat more systemic, to have a survivor go with first responders. I'm curious what kind of response you get on that suggestion from people, from law enforcement, for instance, because it seems like that could be controversial, complicated.
We actually have a great relationship with the sheriff's department here, and they do utilize our survivor mentors. So if a young person comes in, they are the first ones to call our crisis line, and our team goes out and works with them. So we have a great relationship. I think it's a model that works great in Jacksonville, and I think other communities need to do it more often.
Yeah.
You kind of have to remember that in those situations, often the interactions that these young people have had with law enforcement has not been positive. And so when we're thinking about that, it's really about the concept of trust, that someone is alongside this interaction with law enforcement who is my advocate. And that's almost how it's seen at the beginning. This is someone who's here for me,
Mhm.
not to punish and not to be punitive, but to be my advocate, even at this first touch. And it can truly change the outcome of a situation from the beginning.
But that again, relies on law enforcement seeing this person as a victim. So if you're responding to a scene and a young woman has attacked someone or has shoplifted or has stolen someone's credit cards and used them, you are asking the law enforcement individual, the officer, to view them differently and to kind of allow this person who is a survivor advocate come in and start talking to the person that they are perhaps wanting to interview for criminal
Mm-hmm.
purposes. And so
Mm-hmm.
that must be difficult to change the mindset or to persuade law enforcement that that's an appropriate way to approach a crime scene, right?
That's right. And I mean, it's law enforcement, and it's our community as a whole, right? Because we are trained to look at behaviors and address behaviors. But at the core of the Policy Center's work, it's about, okay, we see the behavior, but let's see what contributed
Mhm.
to this particular moment. What are the contributing factors that led this young person to do the things that you just spoke of? And so it's really about that level of mindfulness and thinking much more deeply about the situations and the issues that contributed to a behavior as opposed to specifically addressing the behavior itself.
Is there a response line for people who are in this circumstance to reach out to, whether in Northeast Florida or anywhere in the state, if they're listening or if they're experiencing something like this?
There are multiple lines. There's national lines and local lines. I know the state recently created a helpline as well. You can visit our website at seethegirl.org, and all of those numbers are listed there.
Yeah. And the report will also be listed there shortly at seethegirl.org. Who's this report designed for? I mean, who should be reading it?
I think everyone should be reading it because everyone brings their unique perspective and lived experience. So if you are someone who is in law enforcement or a social worker, a girl serving professional, this report will hit you differently because it's going to challenge you perhaps to adjust some of the ways that you are doing your everyday work. Um, it's going to challenge you to think about what are the trauma informed, gender responsive ways that I need to be better serving girls in our community. For those of us who are not professionals in that field, it will challenge you to think differently about the issues surrounding human trafficking. When I think so often about how many of us grew up, the songs, the movies, the overall social messaging that we received around prostitutes, who we now know as women who are trafficked and who are victims, it has shaped the way we think of not only the issue, but those who are being victimized. And reports like this help you look at those things differently. And when we talk about policy and practice reform, what we know is that change begins individually within our community. When our community changes its mind about something, that's when the policies, the practices, the votes change to the benefit.
Well, Vicky, Basra, Stacy Ellison, thank you so much for coming on this morning and talking about this new report and sharing it with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Up next, some of the hardest working people in America are homeless. We talked to the author of There Is No Place for Us ahead of his local book reading. Welcome back. My next guest has spent years studying the crisis of working homelessness in America. Brian Goldstone is a journalist and an anthropologist who has written for the New York Times, Guernica, Harper's, and the New Republic. His new book is called There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homelessness in America. He joins us via video ahead of his reading here in Jacksonville next week to talk about it. Brian, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be with you, Anne.
So I will say this looks like a daunting book. I've got it right here. The subject is heavy. The book itself is large, but it is just so unbelievably readable. It is so engaging. It is truly a page turner. And I've seen some reviews which have been very positive, but one comparing it to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which I think is, obviously an extraordinary piece of work as well that people find just so riveting. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that because a big sort of aim with this book was to take issues that so often turn into abstractions, the housing crisis, the homelessness crisis, the crisis of low wage work in America. And for even those who are deeply familiar with these subjects, the aim was to not just put a human face on it, but invite readers to travel along, with these families on their journey in their sort of desperate attempt to secure housing, and to kind of make something that for some people might already be familiar and sort of force us to see it with new eyes and to make that, as you said, extremely readable, so that people would really be pulled into the emotional and visceral reality of what it feels like for parents and their kids and individuals when this most basic human necessity, a place to live, is always out of reach.
You spent years following these 5 families and their children, and their experience sadly typifies the experience of thousands of people. Um, you talk in the book about how this is an emergency that is born less of poverty than prosperity. It's something I kind of mentioned earlier when I was teasing to this segment.
Mm.
You say that families are not falling into homelessness, they're being pushed. Can you explain that?
Absolutely, yeah. It really drives me nuts, and I have said this myself when people say, all these families, all these individuals are falling into homelessness. It makes it sound like they just kind of tripped and stumbled into this insecurity. And you know what? I was really shocked to discover in reporting this book over a period of 5+ years was that at every turn in these family stories there were entire systems that were actively militating against their stability. And you mentioned the argument in the book that counterintuitively, this is not a crisis that is stemming from poverty, as we, I think, um, tend to think about this most extreme form of deprivation, homelessness. We tend to associate it with poverty. We tend to associate homelessness, I think, with the most impoverished parts of our cities or the most impoverished parts of the country. But on the contrary, what I found is that homelessness, the threat of homelessness is becoming especially dire, not in the poorest parts of the country, but in the richest, most rapidly developing parts of the country. It's our, booming cities, our thriving cities, where the threat of homelessness has become especially acute. And I think that is because we're seeing these trends together. We're seeing unemployment at a historic low in many cities. We're seeing corporate profits surge. The signs of growth are everywhere. And it's those very dynamics that are actually, pushing people not just out of the neighborhoods they grew up in, but increasingly out of stable housing altogether. They're wages that our workers who are powering our cities, the wages that they're earning simply are not enough to keep up with skyrocketing rents. And as areas gentrify, as they are revitalized and become redeveloped, poor and working class people become the casualties of that growth.
I want to dig into that in a bit more. But one thing that makes this book so effective, I think, is that we often hear about people who are one or two paychecks away from homelessness, and then we also have this population of the seen homelessness that we see living on the street in tents and in other makeshift shelters. And your book, first of all, really emphasizes how incredibly hard workers the people are that you are following and that you embed with on this whole journey, and that
Mhm.
they are moving from that vulnerability of one or two paychecks
Yeah.
away from homelessness into homelessness. And so it's not this separate group of people, it is this one evolution that you're following.
Yeah. Yes. I try to show in the book that that what we see on the street, as awful as that is, and to be clear, the last 2 years have seen the highest level of homelessness on record. And that, when I say homelessness on record, I'm referring to the homelessness that is counted in the annual homeless census. That is homelessness that is either visible on the street or families and individuals who are living in designated homeless shelters. And the last 2 years have shown the highest rates of that kind of homelessness on record since the homeless census started to be conducted. But I try to show that what we see on the street, the tents, are really just the tip of the iceberg. And in many ways, my book is about the rest of that immense iceberg that is under the water surface, that is invisible, that we're not seeing. And these are overwhelmingly families with children, um, with working parents who are living in their cars, who are trapped in these squalid, often extended stay hotels and motels, who are living in rooming houses, who are doubled up with friends or relatives or coworkers in overcrowded apartments. There's an entire world of homelessness that is out of sight. But as you alluded to, I'm also trying to show that this is all just one big iceberg. We're not talking about this separate population of people, even though these are the hidden homeless, even though these are the homeless who literally don't count. They are left out of the official count. I I show through the course of the reporting how you can be in a hotel room today, in your car tomorrow, and in a tent a year from now. That homelessness is an entire spectrum of insecurity, and it's very fluid. And there are just as many people who are living in tents who get up and go to work the next morning as there are families and individuals in their cars or in these motel rooms who get up and go to work.
Brian, one of the women that you follow in this is Celeste, and her story is dramatic, but also in some ways very typical. Can you talk a little bit about her story? First of all, just how she became homeless.
Yeah, her story begins in a very heart-wrenching and dramatic way. She is leaving her warehouse job one afternoon, and her neighbor calls. She's just picked up the kids from school, and the neighbor calls to say that her rental home is on fire. And by the time Celeste and her kids race back to their rental home, it has been destroyed. And she is optimistic, as wrenching as traumatic as this episode was. She is optimistic that she'll be able to rent another home relatively quickly. But she realizes that just in the time she's been renting this home, the ground has shifted under her feet, that Atlanta, neighborhoods that were affordable for workers like herself have become unaffordable. The city has undergone this much celebrated renaissance, and Celeste realizes that the one consequence of that renaissance is she can't find a place to live. She can't find a place that's affordable. And so what she thought would be a brief housing search turns into this protracted nightmare of a housing search. And finally, she finds an apartment that seems promising, and she goes to apply, and she's rejected because she's told that there's an eviction on her record. Come to find out that the landlord who owned this rental home that burned down was not just a mom and pop landlord, it was a private equity firm that owned tens of thousands of rentals across the state. And when Celeste refused to pay rent on a home that had burned down, and by the way, it was later revealed that an abusive ex who was arrested for arson was responsible for this fire. When Celeste refused to pay rent on this home that had burned down, this private equity landlord filed an eviction against her for non-payment. And because Celeste, as in many states, it was not required that she even be informed that an eviction had been filed against her. She only found out months later, after the judge had handed down a default judgment in her absence. And the reason why Celeste's story is representative and not as dramatic as this circumstance was, not sort of this bizarre anomaly, is because, like millions of other families and individuals in this country, Celeste found herself with this eviction on her record. She found herself joining the ranks of what might be called America's credit underclass. And these are people for whom a 3-digit number, a credit score, has really come to determine whether they have access to something as basic as housing. And with this eviction on her record, Celeste's credit was tanked, and she did what countless other families in her shoes have done, and she went to an extended stay hotel where no credit check was required, only a lot of cash up front. And then she found herself in what another family in the book refers to as the expensive prison of this extended stay hotel.
I want to ask you more about those extended stay hotels because, as you note in the book, they're something that we're all very familiar with. We see them off of the highway or along roads. And some of them, I think we really just think of as extended stay hotels, but you have found that many of them have become a different kind of housing altogether. Can you talk about what purpose they serve in this new economy around homelessness?
Yeah, as a resident of Atlanta, and I'm sure many of your listeners can relate to this, I would drive by these hotels and motels all the time and not realize that, as I came to discover, they are functioning as extremely profitable commercial homeless shelters. These are not hotels as we tend to think of them. Uh, you know, some people might be familiar with the higher end versions of extended stay hotels, places like Residence Inn or Hometown Studios, where traveling business people or nurses might stay. But these extended stays on the budget or economy end of the spectrum are the ones that are truly proliferating across this country amid a national housing crisis. These places are serving as shelter of last resort for people who otherwise would be either on the streets or in their vehicles, or wherever else they could stay, an abandoned warehouse, a storage unit. And what is really remarkable about these hotels is not just the slum conditions that many of that we see that we, and I can't tell you how many hours I spent in a variety of extended stay hotels. The conditions are truly abysmal. What is remarkable is not just those conditions, but the fact that like in Celeste's case, the extended stay hotel room she went to ended up being more than double what she was paying for the rental house that had burned down. But because people have nowhere else to go, these hotels prey on people's desperation, and they are basically able to charge whatever they want. And so these places are extremely expensive. They're extremely profitable. And what is just truly striking is that the same private equity firms and Wall Street investors who are buying up, vast swaths of America's rental housing, like the place Celeste had been living, are also cornering the market on the very places they go when people lose their housing. So Blackstone and Starwood Capital, two private equity giants, during the pandemic, they saw how extremely lucrative all of this insecurity could be. And they bought Extended Stay America, the largest chain of sort of economy extended stay hotels in America. They bought this chain for $6 billion. So homelessness really has become big business. And these hotels are kind of this entire invisible world of homelessness that many of us don't realize exists.
If you're just joining us, I'm talking to Brian Goldstone. He is the author of There Is No Place for Us, Working in Homelessness in America. It is an in-depth study that he did with 5 families who became homeless in the course of his reporting. If you'd like to join our conversation, give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. We've got a call from Daryl in St. Augustine. Good morning, Daryl. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning, Ann. Interesting and show. In my shop next to the convenience store, there has always been a fella who works at the convenience store who lives in his car. So he's working and sleeping right there. Another woman lives in her car, her truck right there too. So any truck stop, you'll find the people that are in the transition. They've lost their house, but they haven't lost everything, and they've moved into their car, and they're getting to work or literally sleeping in the parking lot of their work. So that's just an entire segment of the population that I keep seeing. But they're transitioning from being in a house to being in a car to being in the woods. And it's extraordinarily sad.
Daryl, thanks so much for that. Brian, your book takes place in Atlanta, but the story is universal. Certainly the experience in Jacksonville and in Northeast Florida is no different. Daryl's calling from St. Augustine, but he's seeing it there as well. And you talk about this, people who are waking up to go to their job. One woman who's showering daily in a hose. She's trying to do it in the hours where there aren't men around to watch her, but she's doing it and then heading off early to work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the term working homeless really, it was just stunning to me to know that this term could even exist in America, in the richest nation on the planet, that the term working homeless could even be a thing, should be a scandal. It seems like such a contradictory phrase. And yet, that is becoming the reality for so many people in this country. Right now, there are over 12 million people nationwide who are classified as severely cost burdened. And that means that they are spending at least half of their monthly income on rent alone. And so that is 12 million people for whom the slightest setback or unanticipated expense, a family emergency, a missed paycheck, car trouble, it can really be disastrous. It can cause them to lose their home and to join the ranks of the working homeless. So, the 5 families who I follow in this book, they are not an exception to the rule. They are increasingly becoming the rule. But they really upend, I think, these stories upend our collective assumptions about not just homelessness and the myths we have told ourselves about homelessness, like that it's the result of people being lazy, or it's the result of these individual problems. And we see how structural and policy driven this crisis is, but it also upends our assumptions about work, that if you just work hard enough, if you just clock enough hours, you might not make it rich, but you'll at least have your most basic material needs met. And these families, like the millions of families like them across the country, they expose how not just how fragile, but really how false that story is.
You write in the book that there isn't, I'm quoting here, there isn't a single state, metropolitan area, or county in the United States where a full time worker earning the local minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And speaking about the work and the work ethic, really, of the people that you follow, it is unbelievable. The people who are working double and triple shifts to try to earn enough to rent an apartment or to rent one of these extended stay hotels. They're
Yeah.
working longer hours and harder jobs than I think most of us could imagine.
Absolutely. They really couldn't work anymore. Like, it wouldn't be physically possible for them to work anymore. One of the families of the Celeste, who we were speaking about a moment ago, whose house burned down, tragically, she is later diagnosed with ovarian and breast cancer as she's living at this extended stay hotel room with her children. And she is having to decide, do I go to my warehouse job or do I go to my chemo appointment? Because if I go to my chemo appointment, I don't have sick leave. I can't afford to miss a paycheck because I don't have this benefit of sick leave. And so that is what we are forcing workers to choose in this country. And I think that brings up an important point, which is that we often talk in when we're speaking about the affordability crisis about the growing chasm between what workers are earning in their jobs and just what it costs to have a place to live. And that's certainly true. That's true even in Jacksonville, even in Florida, where just this week the minimum wage went up to $14 an hour. That might seem really high for some people. It's certainly high compared to the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, which is still the minimum wage here in Georgia. But when you consider that the housing wage, and by housing wage, I mean it's a figure that the National Low Income Housing Coalition comes up with every year for every sort of area of the country, city, metro area, and they show how much it would require, how much a worker needs to earn per hour to afford just a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And in Jacksonville, the housing wage right now is $33.27 an hour. That is what it costs just to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And so yes, that gap is very important, but equally important is that the nature of work itself has changed, becoming ever more volatile, ever more precarious, where people don't know how many hours they're going to be getting from one week to the next, where their employer gives them 29 hours a week because at 30 they would be eligible for health insurance and benefits like sick leave. So it's also how precarious work has become, the gigification of work, contracted out to third parties, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers who don't have any of the benefits that would come with full-time employment and other circumstances. So that is really what we need to be talking about, not just that wages aren't keeping up with housing costs.
Yeah, and as you note, the problem in Jacksonville, we know that there's 30,000 or more families that are in need of safe and affordable housing, in addition to our homelessness problem. But
Yes.
there is obviously a housing problem, and I want to talk more about that. We're going to need to take a short break, but I want to talk more about the role of prosperity in creating this problem, and in terms of escalating rents, and then also just people who are able to profit off of this system. I'm talking to Brian Goldstone. He's the author of There Is No Place for Us: Working in in America. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just 2 minutes.
I'm Peter O'Dowd. You've probably heard about the importance of setting boundaries for stronger relationships, but what exactly does that mean? Psychologists say setting a boundary is not about controlling other people, it's about looking at your own behavior. How to set boundaries. Next time on Here and Now.
Today at 1 on WJCT News 89.9.
On the next Fresh Air, Dwayne Johnson once considered switching from wrestling to mixed martial arts. He never did it, but now he plays a pioneer of MMA in the new film, The Smashing Machine, based on the life of Mark Kerr. Johnson talks about the film, being The Rock, and being a third-generation wrestler in his family. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Part of the joy of baseball is arguing with the ump, whether from your couch or in a dugout emptying melee. But can you argue with a robot? Well, next season, Major League Baseball is adding an automated system to call balls and strikes. A human umpire will still be behind the plate, but batters can request instant reviews from the robotic system. Will it make for a fairer game or drain the human drama out of America's pastime? That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
The Supreme Court begins its new term next week. The High Court has agreed to hear cases on several hot-button issues like tariffs, trans athletes in sports, and the use of presidential power. The rulings could change constitutional precedent as we know it. What's at stake in these cases next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I am talking to Brian Goldstone. He is the author of There Is No Place for Us, ahead of his reading here in Jacksonville Beach, in fact, at the Palms Presbyterian Church. That's next Thursday. And we're talking about housing affordability and homelessness. And in fact, Brian, I want to start with a call from Samantha on the South Side. Good morning, Samantha. Go ahead.
Hi, Anne. Hi, Brian. Thank you for taking the call. I just finished reading Brian's book, and I was so thrilled to turn the radio on and hear his voice this morning. This is such an important topic. I just wanted to say, a couple years ago, back during COVID, my rent went from $1,200 a month to almost $2,000 a month year over year, and I could not believe that was legal. I could not believe that, everybody wasn't up in arms in that, and it hasn't gotten any better in the years since then. And this has been a huge passion project of mine locally since then. And I just want to thank Brian so much for writing this book. It's so incredibly important.
Oh, thank you, Samantha. Thank you so much.
Samantha, thanks for the call. I mean, to her point, you've reported that the rate by which rent has increased income is 325%, which is just staggering. There is a safety net that is in place federally called Section 8 housing, and you talk about that in your book. Why is that not working?
Well, one reason it's not working is because it isn't funded anywhere close to the scale of the need. So over the last several years, only 1 in 4 households who check all of the boxes to qualify for this really vital form of housing assistance, a housing voucher, which helps subsidize your monthly rent. Only 1 in 4 households who check all those boxes, who work, who have all the other requirements, are actually able to receive it. And the fact that we actually conduct what are called, voucher lotteries in cities across the country to decide who will get access to this assistance tells us everything we need to know. The fact that the word lottery is used in relation to this fundamental human necessity, just a home, shows us just like how I think perverse our relationship to housing as a nation has become.
One of the people you speak to in the book compares it, calls it the housing Hunger Games, which I think is,
Mm,
a, dramatic way of portraying it. And one of the people that you profile in the book wins one of these
yeah,
lotteries, wins a voucher, and it is something that she believes is going to be transformative, and it
yeah.
doesn't turn out that way.
Yeah, that you're referring to Brit, and Brit's story really illustrates powerfully, I think, exactly that point we were speaking about a moment ago about how this is a crisis of prosperity, not poverty. Because Brit, you know, uh, she her roots in Atlanta go back 5 generations. She loves her city. She loves the new Atlanta, how all the new amenities. She loves all the new development. She loves the Atlanta Beltline, which circles the city and has really just transformed the urban center, um, uh, with new boutique hotels and yoga studios and cafes and all the other sort of markers of gentrification. She actually loves all of that. But she realizes that getting a housing voucher is going to be the only way that she's able to afford to stay in the city of her birth with her children, to have a home. And she ends up getting a voucher and then losing it because it expires when no landlord will accept it. And in gentrifying cities like Atlanta, and here Atlanta really is more representative of what we're seeing in cities across the country, where you have all of this growth. And what we're seeing along with that are landlords who are saying, I'm not going to take this voucher because then I have to cap rents at a certain level. I want to be able to jack rents up as much as I want from one year to the next, as Samantha was just describing. And when Britt can't find a single landlord who will accept her voucher, she loses it. And the year she loses her voucher, she is one of, I believe, 1,100 other households in Atlanta out of 1,600 who received a voucher, who loses the voucher because she can't find a landlord to accept it. And that is directly related to all of the development and all of the growth that Atlanta has seen. The title of the book actually comes from Britt. She returns to a place near where she grew up, where she had been living with her kids at one point, and she looks around at all the new development and the artist rendering of this new apartment complex of luxury units, and she says, wow, this place will be really nice when it's done, but for me and my kids, there's no place for us here. And that title, There Is No Place for Us, it's just as much a Chicago title, a Nashville title, a Jacksonville title, I'm sure, as it is an Atlanta title.
Yeah. And what makes that story about the losing the voucher so tragic is, as you report, there are families who are waiting years, if not decades, to get that voucher, and then to have it and to lose it is, it's just like so many of the stories in this book, just gut wrenching. And I know that when you're in Jacksonville, you'll probably be hearing questions because, like the Beltline, this city is also creating a multi use, vast network trail that is already creating some impacts of gentrification through historic neighborhoods, particularly historic Black neighborhoods in Jacksonville. Um, I do want to say your reading is in Jacksonville Beach. It's Thursday, October 9th. It's free, but you are required to register for the event. So you can go to the Palms Presbyterian Church site for that. Anything in particular that you're going to be tackling when you're here, Brian?
I think just really looking at how the trends that I'm describing in the book and the stories that I'm telling through these families' experiences, how it relates to the reality that folks are seeing on the ground in Jacksonville and other communities in Florida, and also how we can address this, how we can solve this problem at the scale of the catastrophe that it's become.
Well, Brian Goldstone, it's a pleasure to talk to you. He's the author of There Is No Place for Us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, we'll be back tomorrow. Thank you.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or BaptistJax.com. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused